There's a country in South America that, on paper, simply shouldn't work. Too narrow to grow, one of the driest places on Earth in the north, torn apart by fjords and cold in the south, sitting on top of ground that never really stops shaking. And yet, this impossible country became the most economically solid nation in Latin America, and a key player in the technology sitting in your pocket right now. If you stretch this territory over a map of Europe, it would reach from Lisbon past Moscow, more than 2,600 miles long. But the average width, just about 110 miles. In some places, you can drive across the entire country in under 2 hours. On top of that, parts of its desert haven't seen rain in over 400 years. Everything about this place looks like a recipe for failure. So how did it become Latin America's benchmark for economic performance? And why are the foundations of that model now starting to crack? To answer that, we need to look beyond the GDP numbers. GDP per capita is a country's total economic output divided by its population, a way to measure not just how big an economy is, but how efficiently it works. On paper, Chile looks impressive. But numbers alone don't explain how a geographically trapped country turned into a global case study, or why decisions made decades ago are now shaping what you pay for energy, electronics, and even electric cars. That country is Chile. And the real story isn't just about growth. It's about how geography forced a very specific kind of state to emerge, how that state created an economic experiment the whole world started watching, and how that experiment left deep inequalities under the surface. In this video, we'll see how a land prison became a development model, why that model is being challenged from within, and how Chile's decisions about copper and inequality in the next few decades will ripple into your daily life. Stay until the end, because what happens in Chile isn't just a South American story, it's a preview of the trade-offs every country will face in the transition to a new energy world. Geography didn't just draw Chile's borders, it built its cell. Picture a country squeezed between two forces that don't negotiate. On one side, the Andes, a wall of mountains reaching nearly 23,000 feet at their highest points. On the other, the Pacific Ocean, cold, violent, with currents that make large stretches of the coast impossible to develop. This strip of land wasn't a choice, it was a geographic sentence. And it determined everything. Where cities could grow, where goods could move, who could get in, and who would stay out. When the Spanish arrived in the 1500s, pushing past the Andes cost lives and took months. Chile was cut off. The colonizers themselves called it the end of the world. Unlike Peru or Mexico, where they found empires rich in gold and silver, here what they had was brutal terrain, harsh climate, and indigenous peoples, especially the Mapuche, who had absolutely no intention of letting anyone through. The result? Chile became the colony Spain never fully controlled. The same geographic prison that kept the Spanish out was the one that, centuries later, kept political chaos at bay. But that protection came with a price that only became clear a century later, because the isolation that shielded Chile also shaped every choice the country was forced to make when it finally needed to grow. After independence in 1818, nearly all of Latin America collapsed into political chaos. Coups, civil wars, leaders looting their own national treasuries. That was the pattern across the continent. But Chile took a different path, not because its leaders were more virtuous, but because geography had already created very specific conditions. The narrow, concentrated territory made political control far easier to maintain. There were no remote, autonomous regions fighting for independence the way Brazil and Argentina had to deal with. Power stayed centralized. And that centralization, even though it was oligarchic, meaning power remained in the hands of a small, closed elite, allowed something rare at the time, peaceful transfers of government for decades in a row. The results showed up fast in the numbers. By 1870, Chile's GDP per capita was roughly double Mexico's, higher than any other country in the region. With that stability, Chile could do something its neighbors couldn't: invest. In infrastructure, in ports, in basic education, to attract skilled workers from Europe. Then came the War of the Pacific, from 1879 to 1884. Chile fought Peru and Bolivia and won. The victory brought mineral-rich northern territories packed with nitrate, the most valuable fertilizer in the world at the time, and copper. The country added nearly 300 miles to its length and decades of economic advantage over the defeated nations. Bolivia lost its access to the sea in that war, and it never got it back. Chile's advantage wasn't luck. It came from a specific combination of concentrated geography and early institutional stability, something most Latin American countries are still searching for today. But if the model was so solid, why did the 20th century turn out so turbulent? In the early 1970s, Chile elected Salvador Allende, the first Marxist president ever elected democratically in the world. Allende began nationalizing sectors of the economy and implementing deep reforms. Nationalizing means transferring private companies under government control. At the height of the Cold War, that was enough to put Chile directly in Washington's crosshairs. The United States, which had no intention of watching another Cuba take root in South America, actively worked to destabilize the government. In September 1973, a military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet brought Allende down. What followed was one of the most brutal dictatorships in South American history, with thousands killed, disappeared, and tortured. But at the same time it was repressing, Pinochet handed the economy over to a group of economists trained at the University of Chicago under the influence of Milton Friedman. They became known as the Chicago Boys. The experiment they ran was radical. Mass privatizations, including healthcare and education, brutal cuts in public spending, aggressive trade liberalization. Import tariffs slashed from as high as 94% down to a flat 10%. The idea was to turn Chile into the purest free market laboratory in the world. In the short term, it was a disaster. In 1975, industrial production fell 28%. GDP shrank nearly 13%. In 1982, a new crisis brought GDP down more than 14% and unemployment shot up to 24%. The Chicago Boys were pushed out, but their policies, for the most part, stayed. And then, something unexpected happened. When democracy returned in 1990, the Chilean economy began growing consistently, 7.1% a year through 1998. Poverty fell. GDP per capita rose. In 2010, Chile became the first Latin American country to join the OECD, the club of the world's most developed economies, alongside countries like Germany, Japan, and the United States. They were calling it the Chilean miracle. But here's what the big numbers hide. Half of Chilean workers earn less than $550 a month. About 33% of all the wealth generated in the country goes to just 1% of the population. 80% of Chileans have nothing left over at the end of the month after paying their basic bills. In October 2019, the government announced a 4-cent increase in the Santiago metro fare. 4 cents. What followed were the largest protests in Chile's recent history, over $3 billion in property damage. 300,000 people lost their jobs. The country, presented to the world as a model of stability, showed that there was decades of built-up tension sitting just below the surface. Chile had grown. But growing isn't the same as sharing the gains, and that difference is about to redefine the country's role in the world. When we think of strategic natural resources, oil usually comes to mind first, but copper is becoming the new oil of the 21st century. The average electric vehicle uses 4 times more copper than a conventional car. Solar panels, wind turbines, renewable energy transmission cables, they all depend on the metal. And as the world accelerates its energy transition, demand for copper only keeps growing. Chile holds about 27% of the world's copper reserves and is responsible for roughly a quarter of all global production. The Escondida mine in the Atacama Desert is the largest copper mine on Earth, so massive it's visible from space. That puts Chile in a position very few countries occupy, owner of a resource the entire world is going to need more and more of. But there's a tension buried in that position. Most of the extraction is controlled by foreign companies operating under extremely favorable tax terms, a direct product of the Chicago Boys' policies. While copper leaves Chilean soil and finances the energy transition of wealthy nations, A significant portion of the workers living in the northern mining towns still can't make it to the end of the month. If the Chilean people decide they want to renegotiate the terms of that equation, the consequences will reach far beyond their borders. Chile isn't just an interesting South American geopolitical case. It's a critical node in the supply chain that will power the planet's future, and the fight over who controls that node has already started. So let's go back to where we started. How did a geographically impossible country, narrow, earthquake-prone, arid, isolated, become the most economically solid nation in Latin America? The answer is that geography wasn't the obstacle. It was the mold. It forced centralization, which created stability. Stability enabled investment. Investment built institutions, and those institutions survived dictatorships and crises because they had deeper roots than anywhere else on the continent. But geography doesn't fix inequality. No economic model does that on its own. Chile proves it's possible to build prosperity under impossible conditions, but it also proves that prosperity on paper and prosperity in people's actual lives are two completely different things, and that the distance between them, when it grows too large, always comes with a price. What Chile does with its copper, its inequality, and its constitution in the coming decades will say a lot about the kind of country it wants to be, and by extension, about the kind of world we're all building together. Next time, we could dive into the dictatorships the United States backed across Latin America during the Cold War, into Venezuela's economic collapse and how it sent shockwaves through neighboring countries, or into how Bolivia is still trying to rebuild its identity after losing its coastline to Chile over a century ago. You pick in the comments. If you're into this kind of deep dive history that actually explains today's headlines, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. See you on the next journey through the history that still shapes our present.